The 1970s brought global fame to many British icons, but for some, the spotlight burned rather than shined. While they smiled for the cameras, behind the scenes they secretly loathed the roles that made them rich, feeling trapped by the very characters the public adored. Today, we uncover 10 stars who despised their own work and the industry that controlled them. Subscribe to our channel and comment below. Would you trade your happiness for fame? Let us reveal the bitter truth behind the glamour. Sir Alec Guinness. To the generation that came of age in the 1970s, he was known simply as the wise old wizard of the galaxy, a figure of benevolence and mystical power who guided the hero on his journey. However, for Sir Alec Guinness himself, the role of Obi-Wan Kenobi in Star Wars was not a career highlight, but a source of profound professional embarrassment and personal misery. Before he donned the brown robes in 1976, Guinness was considered one of the finest actors Britain had ever produced, a titan of the stage and a star of sophisticated comedies and deep dramas like The Bridge on the River Kwai. When the script for George Lucas's space opera landed on his desk, he did not see a cultural phenomenon. He saw what he described in his private letters as fairy tale rubbish. He viewed the dialogue as excruciatingly bad, a collection of mumbo-jumbo that he felt was beneath his dignity, yet he accepted the part largely for the financial security it promised rather than any artistic merit. The production process itself was a trial of endurance for the veteran actor. Filming took place in the heat of Tunisia and the sound stages of London, and throughout the shoot, Guinness felt entirely out of place. He was surrounded by a cast of young, relatively inexperienced actors whom he found pleasant but baffled by, and he struggled to take the material seriously. In his correspondence with friends during the 1970s, he frequently lamented the banal lines he was forced to deliver, complaining that he had to struggle to make them sound like natural speech. He found the concept of the Force to be nonsensical and was constantly irritated by the rewrites that arrived on set, feeling that the character was being diminished with every change. For a man used to the works of Shakespeare and Dickens, pretending to interact with robots and imaginary creatures was a humiliating reduction of his craft. When the film was released in 1977 and became the highest-grossing motion picture in history, Guinness's nightmare truly began. He was suddenly besieged by a level of fame he had never experienced nor wanted. He was horrified to find himself the idol of millions of children and sci-fi enthusiasts who saw him only as the space wizard, completely ignoring his decades of acclaimed work in the theater. He found the fan culture that sprang up around the movie to be baffling and often repulsive. There is a famous, perhaps apocryphal story that perfectly encapsulates his attitude. A young boy approached him asking for an autograph, claiming he had seen the film over 100 times. Guinness agreed to sign only on the condition that the boy promised to never watch the film again, a desperate attempt to encourage the child to experience the real world rather than the fantasy one Guinness so despised. The irony of his hatred was that Star Wars made him wealthier than he could have ever imagined. He had shrewdly negotiated a deal for 2.25% of the film's royalties, a decision that secured his financial future and that of his family for generations. However, this wealth came with a bitterness that lingered for the rest of his life. He felt that the colossal success of the franchise overshadowed everything else he had achieved. In interviews throughout the late 70s and beyond, he would often become prickly if the subject was raised, trying to steer the conversation back to his serious work. He threw away fan mail unopened because the sheer volume was overwhelming, and the content, in his eyes, was trivial. For Alec Guinness, the 1970s were a decade where he sold his artistic soul for a fortune, a transaction he seemed to regret even as he cashed the checks. He loathed the idea that his obituary would lead with the name Obi-Wan Kenobi, a character he considered two-dimensional and boring. His experience stands as a stark reminder that commercial success and artistic satisfaction are rarely the same thing. While the world celebrated him as a hero of the rebellion, privately, he was a man trapped by a role he considered to be nonsense, yearning for the days when acting was about the complexity of the human condition rather than special effects and laser swords. He played the part of the wise mentor to perfection, but behind the beard and the hood was an actor gritting his teeth, waiting for the director to yell, "Cut!" so he could escape the galaxy far, far away and return to the reality he preferred. Sean Connery. By the dawn of the 1970s, Sean Connery was arguably the most famous actor on the planet, the living embodiment of suave masculinity and British cool. However, behind the tuxedo and the Walther PPK, the Scotsman harbored a burning resentment for the character that had made him a global icon. To the public, he was James Bond, but to Connery, Agent 007 was a Frankenstein's monster that had consumed his identity and stifled his artistic growth. His return to the franchise in 1971 for Diamonds Are Forever was not a labor of love, but a calculated business transaction born out of frustration and a desire to settle a score with the industry that he felt had exploited him for a decade. He did not step onto the set with enthusiasm. He arrived with a deep-seated loathing for the machinery of the blockbuster film. The source of Connery's hatred was rooted in his toxic relationship with the franchise's producers, Harry Saltzman and Albert Broccoli. Throughout the 60s, Connery had watched as the Bond films generated hundreds of millions in revenue, while he felt his own compensation was disproportionately low. By the time the 70s arrived, he had become embittered by what he saw as corporate greed. He famously stated in interviews that he had grown to despise the character so much that he wanted to kill him. The role, which required him to deliver endless one-liners and perform increasingly outlandish stunts, had become a golden cage. He yearned for complex, dramatic work, but the world only wanted to see him ordering martinis and seducing women, a stereotype he found increasingly shallow and boring. When he was lured back for Diamonds Are Forever after the departure of George Lazenby, Connery wielded his disdain like a weapon. He demanded a salary that was unheard of at the time, $1.25 million, plus a percentage of the gross profits. In a move that perfectly illustrated his contempt for the studio's money and his desire to distance himself from the commercialism of the role, he used the entire upfront fee to establish the Scottish International Education Trust. It was a grand gesture of defiance, signaling that while the producers could buy his presence, they could not buy his passion. On set, the atmosphere was professional but icy. Connery was there to do a job, take the money, and leave the world of espionage behind forever. Or so he thought at the time. The hatred went beyond just the producers. It extended to the invasive nature of the work itself. Connery was a private man who valued his solitude, but the role of Bond brought with it a level of public scrutiny that drove him to the brink of madness. During the promotion of the film in the early 70s, he was mobbed wherever he went, unable to walk down a street or eat a meal without being accosted by fans who could not separate the man from the spy. He described the press junkets as a goldfish ball, a humiliating parade where he was forced to answer the same inane questions about gadgets and girls 1,000 times over. This loss of anonymity was the price of the job, and it was a price he was no longer willing to pay. Throughout the rest of the 1970s, Connery went to extreme lengths to dismantle the image he loathed. He took on roles that were deliberately unglamorous and rugged to prove he was a serious actor. He appeared in The Offense as a disturbed police detective and donned a red loincloth for the bizarre science fiction film Zardoz. These choices were a direct reaction to his hatred of the smooth, polished Bond persona. He was desperate to show the industry that he had range, that he could play villains, broken men, and eccentrics. Every role he chose in that decade was a silent protest against the tuxedo, a frantic attempt to scrub the scent of 007 off his skin. Ultimately, Sean Connery's experience in the early 70s is a study in the misery of typecasting. He possessed everything an actor is supposed to want: fame, fortune, and adoration, yet he viewed his most famous work with absolute contempt. He felt that the character had turned him into a commodity, a piece of merchandise to be sold alongside toy cars and lunchboxes. His performance in Diamonds Are Forever is often critiqued for appearing somewhat bored or detached, a reflection of his genuine feelings at the time. He had won the war for better pay, but the battle for his artistic soul left him weary and cynical. To the world, he was the hero. To himself, he was a prisoner of his own success, counting down the days until he could hang up the holster and never look back. Christopher Lee. To the audiences of the 1970s, Christopher Lee was the undisputed Prince of Darkness, a figure of terror who commanded the screen with blood-red eyes and a lethal elegance. However, The reality for the man behind the fangs was one of profound frustration and artistic suffocation. By the time the decade began, Lee had grown to loathe the role of Count Dracula with a passion that bordered on hostility. He felt trapped in a caricature, forced to reprise a character he believed had degenerated from a literary icon into a silent, snarling monster in increasingly absurdity scripts produced by Hammer Films. While the public queued around the block to see him rise from the grave, Lee was privately fighting a war with the studio executives, desperate to hang up the cape for good. The 1970s marked the nadir of his relationship with the franchise, particularly with films like Dracula AD 1972 and The Satanic Rites of Dracula. Lee found the attempt to bring the Gothic vampire into the swinging, modern London setting to be utterly ridiculous. He viewed the dialogue as so atrocious that he frequently refused to say the lines written for him, leading to the famous instances where the Count hisses and glares but says almost nothing. It was not an artistic choice for mystery. It was an act of protest by an actor who was classically trained and fluent in multiple languages, yet was being reduced to a pantomime villain. He later described the scripts of this era as abysmal, feeling that the integrity of Bram Stoker's original creation was being sacrificed for cheap thrills and quick box office returns. What kept him returning to the coffin throughout the early 70s was not a love for the role, but a form of emotional blackmail employed by the studio heads. Whenever Lee attempted to quit, the producers would call him and guilt him into submission, telling him that the film had already been sold on his name alone. They would whisper that if he refused to sign the contract, the production would be cancelled, and hundreds of crew members, carpenters, electricians, and makeup artists would lose their jobs. Lee, being a man of great honor and loyalty to the working crews, could not bear the weight of putting people out of work, so he reluctantly agreed, returning to a set he despised to play a part he hated. This professional misery was compounded by his fear of being permanently typecast. In the 1970s, he watched as his close friend Peter Cushing managed to secure a variety of roles while he was constantly offered the same monsters and madmen. He yearned to showcase his versatility, to sing, to play comedy, and to be taken seriously as a dramatic actor. The horror label felt like a millstone around his neck, limiting his opportunities in an industry that often looked down on genre films. He felt that his true capabilities were being wasted on productions that involved fake bats and buckets of bright red paint, while the serious cinema of the decade passed him by. By the middle of the decade, the situation had become untenable. The release of The Man with the Golden Gun in 1974, where he played the villain Scaramanga, was a crucial turning point, allowing him to step sideways into the Bond franchise, but the shadow of the vampire still loomed large. His decision to eventually leave Britain and move to the United States later in the decade was driven largely by his desperate need to escape the specters of the Hammer Studios. Christopher Lee's experience in the 70s is a testament to the loneliness of the icon. He was adored by millions for the very thing that made him miserable, forced to wear a mask he detested to save the livelihoods of others, all while silently screaming for a chance to be seen as a man, not a monster. Kenneth Williams. If there was one face that defined the British comedy landscape of the 1970s, it was the haughty, flared nostril expression of Kenneth Williams. As the mainstay of the Carry On franchise, he was a national treasure, beloved for his camp mannerisms and double entendres. Yet, the diaries he kept throughout the decade reveal a man who held his most famous work in absolute contempt. Kenneth was an intellectual, a man who adored poetry, philosophy, and high art, and he found the relentless smut of the Carry On films to be a personal insult to his intelligence. He frequently described the scripts as filth and rubbish, despairing at the fact that his formidable acting talents were being wasted on cheap gags about hospital bedpans and toilet humor. While the public laughed, Kenneth was often crying in his dressing room, feeling trapped in a vulgar pantomime that he could not escape. The tragedy of his career in the 1970s was compounded by the financial exploitation he suffered. Despite being the star attraction who put bottoms on seats, Kenneth was paid a pittance compared to the profits the films generated. There were no royalties, only a flat fee of roughly £5,000 per film, a sum that stagnated even as inflation soared during the decade. He famously described the pay as monkey nuts, yet his deep-seated insecurity and fear of poverty kept him returning to the franchise again and again. He was terrified that if he turned down a role, the phone would stop ringing altogether, a fear that the producers ruthlessly exploited. They knew they could get him cheap because, deep down, he did not believe he was worth more, a lack of self-worth that stood in stark contrast to his arrogant on-screen persona. On the sets of films like Carry On Abroad and Carry On Girls, the atmosphere behind the scenes was often toxic. Kenneth loathed the lack of professionalism he perceived in his colleagues and the production line mentality of the filming schedule. He yearned to be a serious director or a dramatic actor in the theater, but the industry refused to see him as anything other than the funny man with the funny voice. The 1970s saw the franchise decline in quality, becoming sleazier and more desperate, and Kenneth felt this decline keenly. He viewed himself as a prisoner of his own creation, forced to spout lines that made him cringe, performing for an audience he often claimed to despise for their low-brow tastes. His private writings from this era are heartbreakingly dark, filled with references to his loneliness and his belief that his career was a failure. While he was holding court on talk shows, dazzling guests with his wit, he was returning to an empty flat, consumed by the thought that he had squandered his potential. He felt that the Carry On films had branded him, making it impossible for directors to cast him in the serious roles he craved. He was a man of immense erudition who could quote literature by the yard, yet he will be forever remembered for dropping his trousers and making a funny noise. By the end of the 1970s, Kenneth Williams was a man exhausted by the effort of maintaining the mask. He hated the association with the bawdy comedies that made him a star, yet he was addicted to the applause and the validation they brought. His story is one of the most complex in British show business. A man who gave the world laughter while drowning in his own professional misery, despising the very work that made him immortal. He was the sad clown personified, a genius trapped in a medium he felt was beneath him, forever sneering at the world that refused to take him seriously. Peter Sellers. There has perhaps never been a more tortured genius in the history of British entertainment than Peter Sellers, a man who could make the entire world weep with laughter while he himself was drowning in a sea of depression and professional resentment. By the time the 1970s arrived, Sellers was in a career slump, his box office appeal having waned significantly since the swinging 60s. To resurrect his fortunes, he was forced to return to the one role he had come to loathe with a burning passion, the bumbling French detective, Inspector Clouseau. While the public rejoiced at the release of The Return of the Pink Panther in 1975, seeing it as a glorious comeback, for Sellers it was a humiliating admission of defeat. He viewed Clouseau not as a comic masterpiece, but as a golden millstone around his neck, a vulgar caricature that overshadowed his desire to be recognized as a serious, dramatic artist. The production of the Pink Panther films in the 70s was less like a movie set and more like a battlefield. Sellers' relationship with the director, Blake Edwards, was toxic beyond measure. Despite creating movie magic together, the two men despised one another to such an extent that there were long periods during filming where they refused to speak directly. They would communicate through assistants or by passing furious notes, even when sitting just yards apart. Sellers famously described Edwards as a talentless hack who was riding on his coattails, while Edwards viewed Sellers as a deranged madman whose volatile moods made every day of shooting a living nightmare. This hatred for the director bled into the work itself. Sellers felt that the slapstick physical comedy he was required to perform was beneath him, a cheap trick that relied on falling over furniture rather than the nuanced character work he craved. Behind the scenes, the atmosphere was thick with tension and paranoia. Sellers in the 1970s was a man unraveling, plagued by heart problems and deep-seated insecurity. He would frequently threaten to walk off the set, holding the production hostage to his whims. He felt that the character of Clouseau was eating him alive, stripping away his identity until he no longer knew who Peter Sellers really was. He often spoke of having no personality of his own, merely acting as a vessel for the characters he inhabited, and Clouseau was the most invasive parasite of them all. The role required him to be foolish and incompetent, traits that the vain and ego-driven Sellers hated to project, even in fiction. He wanted to play handsome leading men or complex intellectuals, yet the industry and the audience demanded the trench coat and the ridiculous accent. The financial rewards for these films were astronomical, making Sellers a very wealthy man, yet the money seemed to bring him no joy. He spent lavishly on cars, gadgets, and houses, trying to fill the void, but his professional dissatisfaction remained a constant, gnawing presence. He viewed the Pink Panther sequels, The Pink Panther Strikes Again and Revenge of the Pink Panther, as cynical cash grabs that degraded his talent. He would often sabotage interviews by bad-mouthing the films before they were even released, a habit that infuriated the studio executives who were trying to sell the product. He was biting the hand that fed him because he resented the fact that he was hungry enough to need the food. It was only at the very end of the decade, with the film Being There, that Sellers finally found a role he respected, playing the simple-minded gardener, Chance. He poured his soul into the performance, seeing it as the antidote to the rubbish he had been making for 10 years. However, the tragedy of Peter Sellers is that while Being There brought him critical acclaim, history remembers the 1970s as the decade of Clouseau. He spent 10 years trapped in a slapstick purgatory, making millions of people laugh while he sat in his trailer in a state of misery, hating the mustache, hating the director, and hating the fact that his legacy was being defined by a clumsy detective he wished he had never created. His story is the ultimate example of the sad clown, a man who gave the world joy but could find none for himself in the work that made him a legend. Richard Burton. Richard Burton entered the 1970s as the highest-paid actor in the world, a titan of the stage whose voice was often described as the sound of an earthquake. Yet the decade would see him descend into a deep pit of professional self-loathing. While the public saw a glamorous superstar living a life of excess with Elizabeth Taylor, Burton privately viewed his career with absolute contempt. He frequently described the profession of acting as farcical, ridiculous, and a shameful way for a grown man to earn a living. He was the son of a Welsh coal miner, and throughout the 70s he carried a heavy burden of guilt, feeling that wearing costumes and reciting other people's lines was effeminate and trivial compared to the hard labor of his forefathers. This internal conflict tore him apart, leading him to view every film set not as a creative playground, but as a prison of his own making. The films he chose to make during this decade stand as a testament to his cynicism. Having abandoned the pursuit of artistic excellence, Burton began to accept roles purely for the loot, as he called it. He starred in a string of critical disasters such as Bluebeard, The Klansman, and the universally reviled Exorcist II, The Heretic. He made no secret of the fact that he hated these productions, often arriving on set with a sense of boredom and disdain that was palpable to the crew. In his personal diaries, which offer a window into his tortured soul, he wrote of his desperate desire to be a writer or a scholar, lamenting that he was trapped in the tawdry business of motion pictures simply because the money was too good to refuse. He had become addicted to the lifestyle that his fame provided, creating a golden cage where he was forced to perform in movies he despised to pay for the diamonds, the yachts, and the entourage that surrounded him. His coping mechanism for this profound dissatisfaction was a heavy reliance on liquid courage. Throughout the 1970s, his struggles with the bottle became legendary, but they were not merely the result of a hedonistic lifestyle, they were an anesthetic against the shame he felt every time the director called action. He often performed while under the influence, using the drink to numb the reality that he was squandering one of the greatest talents of his generation on unworthy material. There were days on the set of The Klansman where he was physically propped up to deliver his lines, a tragic sight for those who remembered his majestic performances as Hamlet or King Arthur. He was a man trying to obliterate his own consciousness because the reality of being a movie star was repulsive to his intellect. The tragedy of Richard Burton in the 1970s was that he was acutely aware of his own decline. He was not an oblivious narcissist, he was a brilliant man who knew exactly what he was doing and hated himself for it. He watched as his peers in the theater continued to do meaningful work while he chased the biggest paycheck, a realization that fueled his depressive episodes. He often spoke of the horror of seeing his face on the screen, claiming that he could not bear to watch his own films because he saw only the sellout, the man who had traded his integrity for a mountain of cash. The industry continued to throw money at him, enabling his self-destruction, while the critics savaged his performances, confirming his own worst fears that he had become a parody of himself. By the end of the decade, Burton was physically and emotionally exhausted. The 1970s had taken a man who could have been the greatest actor of the century and reduced him to a punchline in the tabloids. He had spent 10 years working in a job he loathed, surrounded by sycophants, and trapped in a public persona that he found suffocating. His story is a somber reminder that talent alone does not bring happiness. For Burton, his gift was a curse that chained him to a profession he did not respect. He wanted to be remembered as a man of letters, a serious thinker, but the industry demanded he remain the brooding heartthrob, a role he played with a glass in his hand and a deep, silent scream in his heart. Glenda Jackson. In the 1970s, Glenda Jackson was arguably the most acclaimed actress in the British Empire, a formidable talent who achieved the rare feat of winning 2 Academy Awards for Best Actress within a span of just 3 years. To the outside observer, she was the queen of the screen, delivering powerhouse performances in films like Women in Love and A Touch of Class. However, behind the accolades and the golden statuettes lay a woman who harbored a profound disdain for the very profession that had elevated her. Unlike her peers who thrived on the adoration of the public, Glenda viewed the life of a film star with a mixture of boredom and contempt. She famously refused to attend the Oscar ceremonies to collect her awards, not out of a sense of nervous shyness, but because she simply could not be bothered to cross the Atlantic for what she considered to be a frivolous and self-congratulatory pat on the back. She was likely at home in London, scrubbing her floors or reading a book, utterly indifferent to the glamour of Hollywood. Her hatred for the work stemmed from her intensely pragmatic and intellectual nature. Glenda regarded acting not as a mystical art form, but as a job, and often a rather silly one at that. Throughout the 1970s, she gave interviews in which she dismantled the romantic myth of the movie set, describing the process of filmmaking as boring, boring, boring. She detested the endless waiting around that film production required, sitting in a trailer for hours while lights were adjusted, only to be asked to deliver a line of dialogue that she felt was often banal. For a woman of her sharp intelligence and fierce political engagement, the repetitive and passive nature of screen acting felt like a waste of her life force. She often remarked that acting was not a job for a grown-up, a sentiment that confused the critics who praised her emotional depth but could not understand why she seemed to loathe the medium she mastered. The industry in the 1970s tried desperately to mold her into a traditional leading lady, a box that Glenda kicked against with all her might. She was not interested in being a sex symbol, yet her role in Women in Love had thrust that label upon her. She found the obsession with her physical appearance to be demeaning and irrelevant to her craft. When producers asked her to smile more or to play the game of the red carpet, she responded with a scowl and a biting wit that terrified the press. She was working in a world of fantasy and make-believe, but her feet were firmly planted in the harsh reality of the British working class. She saw the vast sums of money spent on films as grotesque, especially when compared to the struggles of ordinary people, a perspective that made it difficult for her to take her own stardom seriously. Even her choice of roles in the mid-70s seemed to reflect a desire to subvert expectations. While she was winning awards for high drama, she seemed happiest when she was deconstructing her own image, most notably in her appearance on the Morecambe and Wise Christmas special. There, playing a comedy version of herself, she seemed to find a joy that was absent from her serious film work. It was as if she was telling the world that she refused to be put on a pedestal. The lovey culture of the West End and the film studios, with its false sincerity and mutual flattery, was anathema to her. She operated within it because it paid the bills and because she was exceptionally good at it, but she never allowed it to define her worth as a human being. By the end of the decade, the cracks in her patience were becoming visible. The 1970s were the peak of her career, yet they were also the years that solidified her resolve to eventually leave the profession altogether. She felt that she had done acting, that she had explored every emotion and worn every costume, and that there was nothing left but repetition. Her transition into politics later in life was not a sudden whim, but the culmination of years of frustration with a job she found increasingly hollow. Glenda Jackson in the 70s was a paradox, a woman who conquered the acting world while secretly planning her escape, proving that it is possible to be the best at something while simultaneously wishing you were doing almost anything else. Robert Shaw. To the cinema goers of the 1970s, Robert Shaw was the ultimate embodiment of masculine grit, the grizzled shark hunter Quint, who scraped his fingernails down the blackboard in Jaws and terrified an entire generation. However, the man behind the whiskers was a tortured intellectual who viewed the profession of acting with a deep, cynical disdain. Robert Shaw did not consider himself a movie star. In his own mind, he was a serious novelist and a playwright, a man of letters who was forced to dress up and play pretend to pay for his chaotic personal life. Throughout the decade, he was a man at war with his own talent, trapped in a cycle where the work he despised, acting, was the only thing that could fund the lifestyle he needed to write the books that the public largely ignored. He frequently described acting as money for old rope, a phrase that barely concealed his resentment at having to perform for his supper while his literary ambitions remained unfulfilled. The making of Jaws in 1975 stands as the centerpiece of his professional misery. While the film would go on to become the first true summer blockbuster, for Shaw, the production was a descent into hell. Filming on the open ocean was a logistical nightmare, plagued by mechanical failures and endless delays that left the cast stranded on support boats for hours on end. Shaw, a man of fierce intelligence and restless energy, found the boredom excruciating. To cope with the monotony and the fact that he was starring in what he considered to be a giant fish movie, he turned to the bottle with alarming frequency. There were days when his consumption of spirit was so great that he had to be carried onto the set, a functional chaos that somehow resulted in the brilliant Indianapolis speech, yet left him feeling hollow and degraded once the cameras stopped rolling. His disdain for the craft of acting, often manifested in bullying behavior towards those he felt took it too seriously. His feud with co-star Richard Dreyfuss is the stuff of Hollywood legend. Shaw viewed the young American actor's method approach and arrogance as everything that was wrong with the industry. He tormented Dreyfuss relentlessly, mocking his weight and his acting choices, not just for sport, but because Dreyfuss represented the vanity of a profession Shaw secretly loathed. For Shaw, acting was a job to be done quickly and without fuss, so he could return to his typewriter. Seeing someone agonize over motivation infuriated him. He felt that he was surrounded by children playing games while he was a serious artist forced to babysit them, a dynamic that created an explosive tension on the set that the director, Steven Spielberg, barely managed to control. The irony of the 1970s for Robert Shaw was that the more he hated the work, the more successful he became. Films like The Sting and Black Sunday cemented his status as a bankable star, which only deepened his entrapment. He was living as a tax exile in Ireland to protect his earnings from the British government, a situation that put immense pressure on him to keep working to support his large family. He had 10 children and his expensive habits. He was running on a treadmill of high-paying, high-profile roles that offered him no spiritual satisfaction. He famously said that he drank to make the people he worked with a little more interesting, a cutting remark that revealed the depth of his boredom with the Hollywood elite. He yearned to be mentioned in the same breath as the great writers of the 20th century, but he knew that the world only wanted to see him hold a gun or a harpoon. By the late 70s, the physical and emotional toll of this double life was undeniable. He was a man burning the candle at both ends, pushing his body to the limit to finish films he didn't care about so he could buy time to write. His tragic collapse and departure from this world in 1978, at the age of just 51, was the final act of a man who had been consumed by the industry he tried to keep at arm's length. Robert Shaw left behind a legacy of powerful performances, but to the very end, he remained a reluctant icon, a writer who accidentally became a movie star and hated every minute of the fame that took him away from his beloved books. His story is a stark reminder that sometimes the face we show the world is a mask worn to hide a deep and abiding frustration with the path life has forced us to walk. Harry H. Corbett. The story of Harry H. Corbett is one of the most heartbreaking examples of the golden handcuffs of television fame in the 1970s. To the millions of viewers who tuned in every week, he was the lovable, frustrated rag-and-bone man Harold Steptoe, a character woven into the very fabric of British culture. However, to Corbett himself, Harold was not a career-defining triumph, but the executioner of his artistic soul. Before the sitcom phenomenon took over his life, Corbett was hailed by critics as the English Marlon Brando, a method actor of intense power and raw vulnerability who was destined to dominate the Royal Shakespeare Company and the serious cinema of the decade. He entered the 1970s with a desperate hope that he could finally shake off the dust of the junkyard. But instead, the decade saw the trap snap shut, sealing his fate as a man defined by a single, fictional role he had grown to resent with a deep and quiet intensity. The tragedy of his situation in the 1970s was that the character of Harold Steptoe was, in a cruel twist of irony, a man trapped by his circumstances and unable to escape his father, mirroring Corbett's own professional reality. The immense popularity of the series meant that the public refused to accept him as anyone else. When he walked onto a stage to perform in serious dramas, expecting the audience to respect the gravity of the work, he would often be met with shouts of "Harold" and laughter from the stalls. This lack of respect devastated him. He felt that his training, his craft, and his potential were being mocked by a public that only wanted to see him pull a cart and argue with a dirty old man. He famously confided in friends that he felt the sitcom had killed the actor he was born to be, leaving behind a celebrity he did not recognize. The early 1970s saw the release of the Steptoe and Son feature films, productions that brought the misery of the small screen to the cinema. While these films were box office sensations, cementing his financial security, they were a source of artistic despair for Corbett. He found the scripts for the film versions to be increasingly coarse and reliant on vulgarity, a departure from the sharp social realism of the early television episodes. Yet, he felt compelled to do them, driven by the fear that if he stopped playing Harold, the industry would offer him nothing at all. He was caught in a vicious cycle. The more he played the role to stay employed, the more impossible it became for casting directors to see him as anything else. He was a prisoner of his own success, forced to wear the same grubby wig and scarf while his soul yearned for Chekhov and Ibsen. Behind the scenes, the strain of carrying this burden took a visible toll on his health and his spirit. The relationship between Corbett and his co-star, Wilfrid Brambell, was professional but distant, lacking the warmth one might expect from a duo that spent years working so closely. There was a pervasive sadness around Corbett in the studios during this era. He was a chain smoker who seemed to carry a heavy weight on his shoulders, the weight of a potential that was slowly evaporating. He watched as his peers from the theater world moved on to diverse and acclaimed careers, while he remained stuck in the same fictional house in Shepherd's Bush. The industry in the 1970s was ruthless in its pigeonholing. Producers assumed that because he made people laugh, he could not make them cry, ignoring the fact that his performance as Harold was built on a foundation of profound tragedy. By the late 1970s, Corbett had effectively accepted his sentence. He continued to work, appearing in pantomimes and guest spots, but the fire of the English Brando had been dampened by years of typecasting. He had become a national institution, but at the cost of his personal identity. His premature departure from this world in the early 80s was often attributed to the stress and the lifestyle of a man who was deeply unfulfilled. Harry H. Corbett's legacy is a complex one. He gave the 1970s one of its greatest comic creations, but he paid for it with his happiness. He serves as a somber reminder that for a true artist, the applause of the crowd means nothing if it is for a performance that feels like a lie. He wanted to reach the stars. Instead, he was remembered for the junk, James Bolam. To the British public of the 1970s, James Bolam was Terry Collier, the cynical working-class Geordie who, alongside his partner Bob Ferris, defined the male friendship of a generation in Whatever Happened to the Likely Lads. The show was a cultural phenomenon, drawing audiences of over 27 million people, a staggering figure that made Bolam one of the most recognizable faces in the United Kingdom. Yet, behind the laughter and the on-screen camaraderie lay a man who viewed his greatest success with a cold, detached hostility. Unlike his co-star Rodney Bewes, who embraced the fame and the affection of the nation, Bolam was a fiercely private and serious actor who resented the fact that his extensive dramatic range was being overshadowed by a sitcom character he considered to be merely a job. For Bolam, the 1970s were not a celebration of his comic genius, but a constant battle to escape the shadow of Terry Collier, a fight that would destroy a real-life friendship and leave a legacy of bitterness. The tension began almost as soon as the cameras started rolling for the sequel series in 1973. Bolam had always viewed himself as a serious performer, trained in the gritty realism of the theater and cinema, and he found the public's obsession with the lads to be deeply intrusive. He detested the celebrity culture that was beginning to take hold in the 70s, viewing the tabloid interest in his private life as a violation. While the audience saw a Jack the Lad who loved a pint and a laugh, the real James Bolam was an intense, often prickly figure who refused to play the game. He would famously refuse to sign autographs or acknowledge fans who called him Terry in the street, a reaction that often shocked those who expected the warm, approachable character they saw on their television screens every week. He felt that the character was a mask that was suffocating his true identity as an artist. The most tragic casualty of Bolam's hatred for the show was his relationship with Rodney Bewes. On screen, their chemistry was electric, the perfect double act of the decade. Off-screen, however, the dynamic was fraught with a painful asymmetry. Bewes considered them to be friends, but Bolam viewed Bewes as a colleague and eventually as a liability. Bolam looked down on Bewes' willingness to court the press and share anecdotes about their lives. The breaking point came in the late 70s when Bewes shared a harmless personal story about the birth of Bolam's child in a newspaper interview. Bolam, obsessed with protecting his privacy, viewed this as an unforgivable betrayal. He cut Bewes out of his life completely, refusing to speak to him for decades, a silence that lasted until Bewes passed away. It was a cold-hearted dismantling of a partnership that had defined the 1970s, driven by Bolam's desperate need to sever all ties with the show that made him a star. Throughout the decade, Bolam worked tirelessly to prove he was more than just a sitcom actor, taking on gritty roles in plays and dramas like When the Boat Comes In. He wanted to be respected for his craft, not loved for his catchphrases. He found the repetition of the sitcom format to be artistic stagnation, a golden cage that paid the bills but eroded the soul. While the rest of the country looked back on The Likely Lads with nostalgia, Bolam looked back in anger. He effectively blocked repeats of the show for years, denying a generation the chance to see it, simply because he could not bear the reminder of that period in his life. He wanted the work to disappear so that he could be judged on his serious output, a stance that alienated him from the very public that had made him rich. By the end of the 1970s, James Bolam had achieved his goal of becoming a respected dramatic actor, but at a terrible cost to his personal reputation. He is remembered as the man who hated the thing everyone else loved, a star who treated his defining role with disdain. His story is the ultimate example of the grumpy actor syndrome, but it stems from a genuine place of professional frustration. He was a man who felt that the 1970s had tried to turn him into a national pet, a role he refused to play. While Terry Collier would have laughed it off with a pint of ale, James Bolam spent the decade building a fortress around himself to keep the laughter and the world at bay.